Thunder cracked like a whip across Manhattan, shaking the glass walls of Blake Enterprises' 45th floor. Sheets of rain pounded against the windows with relentless fury, drowning the city below in a blur of headlights and restless shadows. The storm had arrived without warning, transforming the skyline into something wild and chaotic, an omen of the disruption about to fracture Ethan Blake's carefully controlled world. Ethan stood behind his obsidian desk, unmoving, his sharp, blue eyes locked on the glowing phone in his hand. The message from Richard Hawthorne burned into his mind like acid on flesh. 24 hours. Less than 1 day to appear at a private yacht gathering that could make or break the most critical acquisition of his career. A deal worth $3.1 billion. A deal that would cement his throne as the undisputed ruler of East Coast technology. The elevator chimed with mechanical precision, slicing through the storm's violence like a blade through silk. Clara Wells appeared in the doorway. Her navy blazer was pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back with the rigid neatness of someone who had spent 3 years meeting impossible expectations. She clutched her tablet against her chest like armor, her face calm, though her pulse raced. Mr. Blake. Her voice carried the steady tone of a woman who had learned to navigate a battlefield where mistakes could destroy entire careers. The Hawthorne yacht party, Ethan said flatly, his words detonating between them. Tomorrow night. Hudson. Harbor. Clara's fingers froze on her tablet. The color drained from her cheeks as though he had struck her. Sir, I can arrange transportation and confirm your attire. You'll be attending with me? The silence that followed was sharp, suffocating. Ethan's gaze pinned her like a butterfly under glass. Richard Hawthorne represents legacy wealth, Ethan said finally, turning slowly toward her. His movement was deliberate, predatory, like a shark circling prey. Traditional values matter to him more than profit margins. He's rejected 3 partnerships because the CEOs were unmarried. To men like him, stability at home proves integrity in business. My empire depends on it. He moved to the rain-lashed windows, hands clasped behind his back as though surveying a battlefield littered with broken men. 3.1 billion, Clara. That's the sum between this company and absolute dominance of the East Coast. That number is the difference between influence and obscurity. And tomorrow night you will help me secure it. Clara's breath caught. The weight of those numbers crushed her chest. Every digit carried her family's reality, her mother's endless treatments, her father's mounting medical bills, her sister's tuition barely holding together. Blake Enterprises wasn't just her career. It was the thread keeping her family alive. Of course, Mr. Blake, she said softly, her throat tight. I'll make the necessary arrangements. The car will arrive at 7 sharp. Black attire, it's a masquerade. Margaret Hawthorne has particular taste for drama and mystery. Ethan dismissed her with a wave, already turning back to the glowing reports on his desk, as if her future hadn't just been sealed in 3 sentences. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the door. The steel handle was cold against her, skin grounding her like ice, and then his voice, calm and merciless, struck her again. Don't disappoint me, Miss Wells. Tomorrow decides everything. The words followed her out into the storm like ghosts, clinging to her every step, haunting her as though her fate had already been written. The storm outside hadn't slowed by the time Clara Wells left Blake Tower. Rain battered the streets of Manhattan in angry sheets, and each drop that struck her umbrella felt like a countdown to disaster. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement as she crossed to the parking garage, every step echoing with the words Ethan Blake had left her with. Don't disappoint me. Tomorrow decides everything. By the time she reached her modest Brooklyn apartment, her body felt like it was carrying an iron weight. The building was far from glamorous, peeling paint, squeaky stairwell rails, but it was home, and every rent check she managed to scrape together bought her and her roommate 1 more month of stability. Inside, the small space was quiet, almost comforting. A world away from the polished glass kingdom of Blake Enterprises. She dropped her bag onto the counter and let out a long, shaky breath. Tomorrow night. A masquerade at Hudson Harbor, surrounded by the wealthiest families in America. pretending to be the stable partner of one of the most powerful men in the business world. She was supposed to smile, stand close, and play a role in securing a deal worth billions. And yet, all she could think about was her mother's fragile condition, the stack of unpaid bills that grew taller by the week, and the aching exhaustion of carrying her family's burdens on shoulders that were already bending under the weight. Ethan Blake had built an empire with brutal precision, demanding perfection from everyone in his orbit. For Clara, failure wasn't an option. Her salary at Blake Enterprises paid for her mother's chemotherapy, her father's heart medication, her sister's tuition at Columbia's medical program. Without it, their lives would unravel. She knew this. Ethan Blake knew it too. That was why he could command her so easily. Why she could never say no. Clara sat down on the edge of her bed, staring at the raindrops racing down the glass of her window. The storm outside felt like a mirror of the storm inside her. Her entire existence was a balance on a razor's edge. Her family's needs on one side, Ethan Blake's empire on the other. And there was no room for her own life, her own happiness, her own choices. Tomorrow night should have been about her family. For the first time in months, there was hope that they might finally come together again, whole if only for an evening. But instead she was bound to Ethan's command, trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. Her chest ached, her throat constricted, and her pulse thundered in her ears. The truth was as merciless as the storm outside her window. When Ethan Blake gave an order, there was no escape. Clara had barely collapsed onto her bed when her phone began to buzz. The sound cut through the steady drum of rain against the window, cruel in its timing. She reached for it, exhaustion heavy in her bones. But the moment she saw the caller ID, her heart leapt. "Dad," she answered quickly, trying to force some lightness into her voice. "Sweetheart," his voice crackled through the line, warm and vibrant in a way she hadn't heard for months. "I have the most wonderful news. News that's going to change everything." Clara sat up straighter, her chest tight with anticipation. "Your mother's doctors cleared her for discharge tomorrow evening," he said, his voice trembling with joy. "She's coming home, Clara. After 8 long months, she's finally coming home." Tears pricked her eyes instantly. 8 months. 8 months of sterile corridors and fluorescent hospital lights. 8 months of late-night calls from waiting rooms, juggling board meetings while praying her mother would survive. 8 months of watching her family's savings drain away, $1 at a time, while hope flickered like a candle against the wind. "That's incredible, Dad," Clara whispered, her throat tight. "And there's more," he continued, his voice brimming with emotion. "Your brother drove down from Boston this morning, and we convinced your sister to take a night off from her residency at Columbia Medical. Tomorrow, for the first time since the accident, the whole family will be together. All of us, in one place again." His words struck her with the force of memory. The accident, the twisted metal on a rain-slick highway, the flashing ambulance lights, the endless hours of surgery and recovery, the fear that had consumed every part of their lives since that night. Now, finally, there was a chance to heal. But as the joy in her father's voice filled the room, another truth pressed down on her like a stone crushing her chest. Tomorrow night, Ethan Blake expected her at his side. Tomorrow night, she would have to stand among New York's elite, masked and silent, pretending to be something she wasn't, all while her family celebrated the miracle they had prayed for. She swallowed hard. The words tasted like ash. "Dad, I have to work tomorrow night." The line went silent. A heavy silence that spread wider and wider like a gulf opening between them. "Work?" he repeated quietly, the single word, once so ordinary, now hollow, lifeless. "On a Saturday night?" The line clicked dead before she could answer. Clara sat frozen, her phone still in her hand, staring at her own reflection in the darkened window. The storm outside battered the glass, each raindrop sliding down like the tears she could no longer hold back. They streamed freely down her face, each one carving deep lines of grief and guilt. Tomorrow was supposed to be a night of joy, A night of family. A night of healing. But tomorrow had already been stolen from her. Clara was still curled up on the couch, tears staining her cheeks, when the apartment door opened. Sophie Grant stepped inside, setting her briefcase down with a thud. Their shared space was modest but warm, a far cry from the luxury of Blake Tower, but filled with the comfort of two women building their lives from nothing. "Clara?" Sophie said softly, taking one look at her roommate and closest friend. "What's breaking you?" Her lawyer's instincts sharpened instantly, reading the devastation written across Clara's face. She crossed the room, crouched down beside her, and brushed damp hair from her cheek. Through broken sobs, Clara spilled everything. The impossible choice Ethan Blake had thrust upon her, the masquerade at Hudson Harbor, the family reunion she would be forced to miss, the weight of a future she couldn't control. Each word felt like it was tearing from her soul. Sophie listened intently, her sharp mind cataloging every detail, but her heart breaking for the woman who had been her closest friend since their college days at NYU. "He can't force you to go," Sophie said firmly, though they both knew the reality was more complicated than any labor law could solve. "And what then?" Clara whispered, wiping at her swollen eyes. "Find another job? No one else will pay me half of what Blake Enterprises does. Not with my background, not with my family depending on me. If I lose this job, I lose everything." Sophie began pacing the small living room, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome of determination. Her legal mind was already working, running through possibilities like a chess master strategizing moves that could change the game. "Tell me about the party," she said suddenly, her eyes narrowing with focus. "Every detail you can remember." Clara sniffed, pulling herself together. "It's on Richard Hawthorne's yacht, a black tie masquerade. Blake says Richard values traditional family appearances. He's old money. Stable image matters to him more than profits. Blake needs me to stand at his side, to look partnered. And Margaret Hawthorne, she loves mystery, the masks, the drama." Sophie stopped pacing. Her expression shifted in the lamplight from sympathy to something sharper, more dangerous. "Clara, what does Ethan Blake actually know about you?" Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean beyond your efficiency, your scheduling skills, your ability to anticipate his needs before he speaks. What does he know about you? Your favorite color, your dreams, your family's struggles? Does he even see you as a person? Or just a function?" Clara's heart sank as she realized the truth. To Ethan Blake, she wasn't a woman. She was an extension of his empire, an assistant, efficient and invisible. Sophie's lips curved into a smile, one that had unsettled opposing counsel in countless courtrooms. Then maybe it's time someone else filled that function. The decision crystallized between them, sharp and undeniable, like fate taking form. "I'll go," Sophie said firmly. "I'll be the one on that yacht. You, Clara, will be with your family where you belong." The words lit the room with a sense of impossible possibility. For the first time that night, Clara allowed herself to breathe. Saturday evening arrived with deceptive beauty. The storm that had torn across Manhattan had passed, leaving behind crisp autumn skies and the golden glow of sunset fading into dusk. But inside Clara Wells's modest Brooklyn apartment, the air was thick with nerves and resolve. Clara packed her overnight bag with trembling fingers, folding clothes with sharp, mechanical precision, her movements fueled by restless energy. In the living room, Sophie Grant stood before their shared mirror, transforming herself into someone entirely new. "Remember," Clara called from the bedroom, her voice unsteady, "he takes his coffee black. No sugar." Sophie applied her lipstick with careful strokes. "Got it. And he hates small talk," Clara added, her words tumbling faster. "Every wasted minute feels to him like money burning away." Sophie gave her reflection a last, steady look. The woman in the mirror no longer looked like Sophie, the sharp young attorney. She looked like Clara Wells, quiet, efficient, controlled. Their similar height and build, their dark hair that caught the light in the same way, gave Sophie a convincing starting point. But the true disguise would come from confidence, something Clara had never been able to wield as a weapon. The black, silk gown had arrived that morning, delivered by courier. It clung to Sophie's figure like liquid shadow, every line elegant, every detail whispering sophistication. Over her face, she placed the delicate black mask Clara had arranged, the final touch in the transformation. In the dim lamplight, even Clara had to admit, the resemblance was startling. "You look—" Clara's voice trailed off. Her throat tightened. "You look like me." "Good," Sophie replied, her tone calm, steady. "That's the point." Exactly 7 o'clock. Headlights flashed outside their window. Blake's Mercedes had arrived, sleek and black, its polished surface reflecting the glow of the street lamps like obsidian. Clara peeked through the blinds, her heart hammering. In her chest, Sophie picked up her small clutch and walked to the door. She turned once, meeting Clara's eyes with unwavering determination. "Go be with your family, Clara. Leave Ethan Blake to me." Clara could only nod, tears welling. Outside, the driver stepped from the Mercedes, checking his watch with military precision. Everything in Ethan Blake's world ran on flawless timing. Sophie slid into the backseat of the car, her nerves steeling as the city lights flashed across the windows. Beside her, Ethan sat with the same rigid composure Clara had described. His jawline was sharper in person, his presence even more commanding than photographs ever captured. He scrolled through his tablet with mechanical focus, barely acknowledging her. "The Hawthorns value tradition above all else," he said, his voice edged with command, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Old money sensibilities, conservative values. When we arrive, stay close but not desperate, sophisticated, not needy. Understand?" "Of course, Mr. Blake," Sophie replied smoothly, mimicking Clara's usual deference, hiding her quickened pulse behind carefully chosen words. Hudson Harbor glittered ahead as the car slipped through traffic with predatory silence. The Hawthorne yacht dominated the marina's most exclusive slip like a floating palace, its pristine white hull gleaming under perfectly placed lights. The surrounding water shimmered like molten silver, reflecting the glow of the chandeliers, spilling through the yacht's windows. On the dock, elegant figures in tailored black formal wear moved toward the boarding stairs. Elaborate masks hid their faces, glinting under the harbor lights like captured stars. Ethan stepped from the car first, his every movement calculated. He extended his hand to Sophie with the practiced grace of a man aware of cameras flashing nearby. His touch was firm but impersonal, a gesture of control, not warmth. "Smile," he murmured under his breath, his lips barely moving behind his mask. "They're watching every move." Sophie obeyed, her lips curving into a poised smile as she slipped her hand into his. Together, they stepped aboard. Inside, the yacht was a palace. Crystal chandeliers glowed against polished hardwood and gleaming brass fixtures. Classical music drifted softly, mingling with the low hum of carefully measured conversations. Everywhere Sophie looked, there were masks, jewels, champagne flutes, and the kind of money that didn't just build fortunes. It shaped entire industries. Her pulse raced, yet she moved with practiced poise, aware that tonight she wasn't Sophie Grant, the lawyer from Brooklyn. She was Clara Wells, the woman Ethan Blake had chosen to present to the Hawthorns as his partner, and in this role, she had to be flawless. The yacht Serenity radiated wealth and authority, its decks lined with the most powerful names in finance and technology. Sophie Grant, masked and poised, let Ethan guide her into the glittering crowd. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture calculated to match the rhythm of his world. "The Hawthorns prize legacy above all else," Ethan murmured, scanning, the faces hidden behind masks, his sharp gaze never still. "Generations of power, family stability. Appearances matter more than profit." He turned his head slightly toward her. "Stay visible. Engage when spoken to. We must appear compatible." Sophie inclined her head, her voice soft and deferential. Of course, Mr. Blake. And then the ripple began. Conversation shifted. Attention drew toward the grand staircase as Richard Hawthorne appeared. His silver hair gleamed beneath the chandeliers, his mask designed not to conceal, but to emphasize the natural authority etched into every line of his face. At his side, Margaret Hawthorne commanded equal presence, draped in black lace, her mask adorned with pearls that shimmered under the lights. Sophie's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said warmly as they drew near, her tone respectful yet filled with admiration. "Your mask is stunning. The pearls catch the harbor lights beautifully." Margaret's lips curved into a smile. She tilted her head with clear pleasure. "How thoughtful of you to notice. Most guests only care about guessing who hides behind the masks." Sophie stepped closer with graceful confidence, drawing Ethan along. "But mystery is only half the elegance, isn't it? Choosing the right mask must have been its own challenge." Margaret laughed lightly, genuine, her eyes sparkling. "You have no idea. Richard thought I was ridiculous, weeks spent choosing the design. But in the end, it had to be perfect." "Not ridiculous at all," Sophie replied smoothly. "The right mask, like the right partnership, transforms everything." Margaret's smile widened, her approval unmistakable. Ethan's eyes flicked toward Sophie, a spark of surprise hidden behind his otherwise stoic mask. He had not expected this ease, this poise. As the evening unfolded, Sophie slipped deeper into the Hawthorne circle. Her legal training gave her an advantage. She could discuss market trends, regulations, and international shifts with intelligence sharp enough to hold Richard's attention. She debated with charm, engaged with precision, and even drew laughter from the normally stoic patriarch. Ethan observed quietly, his carefully maintained composure hiding his astonishment. Clara Wells had always been efficient, professional, invisible when necessary. But tonight she was something else entirely. The music shifted, violins giving way to a slower, more intimate melody. Couples drifted to the open deck where lanterns swayed gently in the harbor breeze. New York glittered in the distance, the skyline twinkling like a scatter of stars across black velvet. Ethan turned to her, extending his hand with practiced formality. "Shall we?" Sophie hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand in his. He led her onto the deck, where masked figures glided in slow circles under the night sky. His hands settled at her waist with controlled precision, his posture rigid as always. But as they began to move together, something shifted. The space between them grew charged, the rhythm of their bodies aligning with unexpected ease. "You're different tonight," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of something uncharacteristic, something almost vulnerable. Sophie met his gaze through the mask, her voice calm, steady, but daring. "Maybe you've never seen me in the right light before." For the first time, Ethan faltered. The woman in his arms didn't feel like the quiet assistant who fetched his coffee and arranged his schedule. She felt like someone else entirely. Someone who could challenge him. Someone who could unnerve him. The admission lingered between them like a spark igniting dry tinder, transforming a simple deception into something far more dangerous. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of measured conversations and stolen glances. By the time Ethan's Mercedes delivered Sophie back to Brooklyn in the pale hours of dawn, both of them knew something fundamental had changed, and from the way Ethan's eyes lingered on her retreating figure, it was clear. He knew it too. Monday. Morning arrived with the brutal clarity of daylight slicing through shadows. Ethan Blake stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office, watching the city awaken. The memory of the yacht lingered like a fever he couldn't shake. The music, the harbor lights, the mysterious woman who had unsettled his perfectly ordered world with nothing more than direct eye contact and quiet brilliance. He had spent all of Sunday replaying the night in his mind like a man possessed. Every laugh, every glance, every step of the dance repeated on a loop. He had studied deals worth billions with less scrutiny than he gave to the memory of her voice, her wit, her fearless presence. At precisely 8:30, The elevator chimed. Clara. Wells stepped inside his office, punctual as always, her navy blazer pressed sharp, her hair tied back in its usual severe style. She carried his coffee and her tablet with quiet efficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said softly, setting the cup on his desk without meeting his eyes. "Your 9 o'clock with the Patterson Group has been moved to 10:30. The Singapore conference call is confirmed for 3 p.m. Ethan turned, his chest tightening. But the woman standing before him was not the same woman who had stood at his side on the yacht. This Clara was composed, invisible, mechanical in her precision. She never looked up, never let her eyes meet his, never allowed him even a flicker of the fire he had seen that night. "The yacht party," Ethan began, his voice slower, probing. "I wanted to discuss. Was everything satisfactory?" Clara's tone was perfectly professional, her gaze fixed on her tablet as if it held the secrets of the universe. "I hope the evening served your business purposes." Her formality hit him like ice water. Where was the woman who had debated Richard Hawthorne on regulatory reforms? The woman who had moved in his arms as though she belonged there? The woman who had made him laugh, actually laugh, in a way he hadn't in years? Ethan studied her, face with the intensity of a man interrogating evidence, searching for something, anything, that could link the assistant in front of him with the mysterious companion from Saturday night. But there was nothing. The transformation was complete, deliberate, unshakable. Meanwhile, across the city, Clara's weekend had unfolded in a completely different light. Her mother's homecoming had been everything she dreamed of. Tears of joy had washed away months of fear as her family embraced whole again after 8 long months of sterile hospital visits. They laughed together, cooked together, and held each other with a tenderness no corporate achievement could replace. For Clara, it was a night of healing. For Ethan, it was a night of obsession. By Tuesday, he was restless, distracted in meetings, his mind endlessly circling back to the woman on the yacht. By Wednesday, it had become obvious. His closest friend and chief legal counsel, Daniel Spencer, a man who had known him since prep school, finally spoke up during a strategy meeting. "You've checked your phone 6 times in the last 10 minutes, Daniel said dryly. "Either you're expecting a national emergency or you've lost your mind over something that has nothing to do with business." "I'm fine," Ethan replied curtly, though his eyes strayed once more toward the glass wall separating his office from the assistant's area. Clara moved through it with her usual quiet efficiency, no trace of the fire he craved. "This is about Saturday night, isn't it?" Daniel pressed, his voice sharp, cutting through Ethan's composure like a scalpel. "The evening was a success," Ethan said, his tone clipped. "Richard Hawthorne practically guaranteed the deal would close within 60 days. "I'm not talking about business." Daniel leaned forward, his expression keen, serious. "I'm talking about the fact that you're acting like a man obsessed. Whoever was with you that night has you undone, Ethan." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Because Daniel was right. Unable to reconcile the contradiction between Saturday's your captivating partner and the reserved assistant he had known for years, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. "I want the security footage from the Hawthorne yacht," he told Daniel, his voice sharp, unyielding. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "That's an extraordinary request. Why?" "Due diligence," Ethan said smoothly. "If we're moving forward with a multi-billion-dollar partnership, I want to review every detail." The explanation was thin, and Daniel knew it, but loyalty won over curiosity. By Thursday morning, Ethan had the footage. He locked himself in Blake Enterprises' private screening room and reviewed every angle, every second with the ruthless precision he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. And what he discovered shattered his world. Frame by frame, the truth unfolded. The woman who had danced in his arms, who had charmed Richard and Margaret Hawthorne, who had looked at him with fire in her eyes, she was not Clara Wells. The resemblance was there, the height, the dark hair, the build, but the confidence, the subtle differences in movement, the unmistakable sharpness of presence. This was someone else entirely. Ethan's chest constricted, his breath caught. He had been deceived, Anger rose inside him, cold and sharp, the kind of fury that had made rivals fear his name. But beneath it was something worse, a hollow, aching realization. The woman who had awakened something in him, a desire deeper than possession, stronger than power, did not exist. Or at least she was, not who he thought she was. Friday morning arrived heavy with inevitability. Ethan Blake had spent the night consumed by rage and something dangerously close to heartbreak. The revelation from the yacht's footage played in his mind on repeat. The woman who had ignited him, challenged him, unsettled him, had not been Clara Wells at all. By dawn, the fury had crystallized into purpose, cold, sharp, merciless. His voice cut across the executive floor like a blade. "Miss Wells, my office, now." Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Everyone recognized that tone. It was the sound of corporate executions, the tone Ethan Blake used when his legendary control finally snapped. Clara entered his office with the slow, careful steps of someone walking to the edge of a cliff. Her face was pale, her composure fragile, as though she already knew what was coming. Ethan stood behind his desk, the posture of a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. On the screen before him, frozen in perfect clarity, was the image of a woman in a black dress laughing at something Richard Hawthorne had said, utterly at ease in a world that should have terrified her. He turned the tablet toward Clara. His voice was quiet, deadly. "Explain." Clara's hands trembled the moment her eyes met the screen. Tears welled instantly, her carefully built professionalism crumbling like sand in a storm. "Mr. Blake, I can explain." "Can you?" His voice was still calm, but it was the kind of calm that preceded eruptions. "Can you explain how my assistant managed to be in two places at once? How the woman I danced with Saturday night bears no resemblance to the woman standing before me right now?" Clara broke. Tears streamed down her face. The secret she had tried to bury surged out with painful honesty. "My mother was coming home from the hospital," she whispered. "It was the first time my family would all be together in 8 months. I couldn't miss it. Not again." Ethan's expression hardened. "So you sent an imposter to deceive me, to make me look like a fool in front of business partners whose trust I cannot afford to lose." His voice cracked like ice breaking under pressure. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "She didn't mean any harm," Clara cried, her voice breaking. "She was only trying to help me. Please, don't blame her." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his chest tightening. "Her? Her name is Sophie," Clara said at last, her words trembling. "My roommate, she's a lawyer, she's brilliant, she only wanted to protect me so I could be with my family." Before Ethan could respond, the office doors flew open. "Sophie," Grant strode in, her presence cutting through the tension like a blade of fire. She was still in her courtroom attire, sharp lines of confidence radiating from her. Her eyes locked on Ethan, unflinching. "Leave her alone," Sophie said firmly, her voice ringing with authority. She stepped in front of Clara, placing herself between her best friend and the billionaire's wrath. "Whatever consequences you think are necessary, direct them at me." Ethan stared, struck silent. For the first time, he saw her clearly without the mask, without the dim harbor lights. The woman who had unsettled him on the yacht, the woman who had sparked something inside him he hadn't felt in years. Even in the harsh fluorescent light of his office, she was striking. But it wasn't her beauty that undid him. It was the undeniable reality that she was real. "You," he said quietly, the single word heavy with 3 days of obsession. "Me," Sophie confirmed, meeting his gaze with steel. "I attended your party. I charmed your business associates, and I made sure Clara could be where she belonged, with her family." "You lied to me," Ethan said, finally finding his voice, low and cutting. "I protected my friend," Sophie countered without hesitation. "There's a difference." Her eyes held his, unwavering. Her voice softened, but her words were absolute. "Some things cannot be acquired, Mr. Blake. They cannot be commanded. They must be earned." The truth of it hung in the air like a judgment, undeniable, irrefutable. Without another word, Sophie took Clara's arm and led her out of the office, leaving Ethan standing alone in the wreckage of his own control. Fallout came faster than Ethan Blake had imagined. Within 48 hours, Richard Hawthorne's lawyers pulled back from the acquisition. A terse statement was delivered to Blake Enterprises' legal team. Hawthorne Holdings values transparency and stability above all else. We cannot align ourselves with partners who present illusions in place of truth. The $3.1 billion deal evaporated like smoke in the wind. Stocks wavered, analysts speculated. Competitors circled like vultures hungry to exploit Blake Enterprises' sudden vulnerability. For the first time in years, Ethan tasted the bitterness of failure. He sat alone in his penthouse, the Manhattan skyline stretching out before him, like a kingdom he no longer controlled. The silence pressed against him, heavier than any storm. He had built his empire on ruthless precision, on numbers and control, on bending others to his will. And yet, in one night, a woman had slipped past all of it, not with power, not with money, but with truth. Her words echoed through him, refusing to die. Some things cannot be acquired. They must be earned. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, but it did nothing to dull the weight in his chest. The memory of Sophie Grant's steady gaze, the fire in her voice, the unshakable conviction, those haunted him more than the financial loss ever could. For the first time, Ethan questioned the very foundation of his world. It was Daniel Spencer, his oldest friend and closest advisor, who finally broke the silence. He came to the penthouse late one evening, finding Ethan standing at the window, glass in hand, his jaw tight with unspoken turmoil. "You've lost before," Daniel said carefully. "Deals collapse, markets turn, you've always recovered." "This is different," Ethan murmured, his voice low, almost foreign to his own ears. Daniel studied him. "Because this time, you didn't just lose money. You lost something you can't replace." Ethan turned sharply, anger sparking, but it wasn't aimed at Daniel. It was aimed at himself. "She played me," he said bitterly. "Made me look like a fool." Daniel shook his head. "She didn't play you. She showed you, and you hate it because she was right. You can't buy what you want this time, Ethan. You can't intimidate it. You can't demand it. If you want her, if you want anything real, you'll have to earn it." The words struck harder than any financial blow. For once, Ethan had no response, no strategy, no retort. Just silence. Over the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into work, but the edge was gone. Meetings blurred together, contracts felt hollow, victories rang empty. At night he returned to his penthouse, staring out over the glittering skyline, always searching for something beyond the glass, something he had lost. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blake wasn't chasing a deal. He was chasing meaning. And the only place he had ever glimpsed it was in the unflinching eyes of Sophie Grant. Winter melted into spring before Ethan Blake saw Sophie Grant again. The city had changed with the seasons, snow vanishing from Central Park, cherry blossoms blooming along Fifth Avenue. But for Ethan, change had been harder. In the months since the Hawthorne deal collapsed, he had rebuilt, not his empire, but himself. He delegated more, stopped working his assistants to the bone, and for the first time in his career, he listened. Daniel had been blunt enough to call it growth. Ethan preferred to think of it as survival. The old ways had nearly destroyed him, not because they cost him money, but because they left him empty. One evening in late April, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, he found himself at a quiet cafe in the West Village. It wasn't the kind of place he used to visit. No velvet ropes, no waiting lists, no investors to impress. Just warm lamplight, scratched wooden tables, and the scent of fresh coffee. And there she was. Sophie sat near the window, her hair falling, in loose waves, a book in her hand. She wasn't wearing a mask or a gown or playing any role at all. She was simply herself, calm, unshaken, radiant in her authenticity. Ethan's chest tightened, his pulse quickening like it hadn't in months. For a moment he considered turning back. The man he used to be, the one who commanded, who acquired, who never asked, would have walked away rather than risk rejection. But he wasn't that man anymore. He approached slowly, each step heavier than the last, until her eyes lifted from the page and found him. There was no fear in them, no surprise, only recognition, steady and unflinching, just as before. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice even, but with a faint curve at the corner of her lips. "Sophie," he replied, his tone softer than he had expected. He stood awkwardly, uncharacteristically uncertain. "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair opposite her. "That depends. Are you here as the man who commands, or the man who learns?" The question hit him like a test, and he knew the answer mattered more than any boardroom negotiation he had ever faced. "I'm here," he said carefully, "as the man who understands that some things cannot be taken. They have to be earned." Her gaze lingered on him, measuring the truth in his words. After a long silence, she closed her book, setting it gently on the table between them. "Then sit," she said at last. And as Ethan lowered himself into the chair, for the first time in his life he felt something unfamiliar. Not conquest, not control, hope.